Всем привет! Мы, наверное, начнем. Меня зовут Варламов, я учитель фонда «Городские проекты». Сейчас я подошел по поводу цели сегодняшнего мероприятия. У меня, конечно, не получится так ярко, как в живую. В принципе, те, кто слышал, он все сказал. Я лишь могу добавить, что собрались здесь по очень важному поводу. Я рад, что столько народу пришло. Сейчас мы заслушаем доклад нашего уважаемого экспертного совета по поводу идей правительства Москвы по реконструкции Ленинского проспекта и Северо-Западной хорды. Вся эта история, которую мы в городских проектах затеяли с приглашением иностранных независимых экспертов, она, в принципе, уникальна. Уникальна она по многим причинам. Во-первых, я не помню, чтобы какие-либо строительные проекты мэрии так обсуждались, чтобы приглашали действительно ученых с мировым именем, чтобы как-то представляли, потому что обычно, вы знаете, как все обсуждения проходят, максимум какие-то общественные слушания, которые, или там митинги жителей, власть пытается все это дело выставить, как собрались какие-то непонятные люди, там, чуть ли не городские сумасшедшие, чего их слушать, а жители, им тяжело тоже на что-то опираться, и они часто голословно обвиняют власть, и здесь дискуссия немножко переходит на другой уровень. Нельзя уже сказать, что те выводы, которые сделал экспертный совет, это бред каких-то городских сумасшедших, не имеющих отношения к реальности.
Во-вторых, эта история уникальна тем, что вы знаете, как вся она происходила. Мы на приглашение международных экспертов собирали денег с жителей Москвы. Ну, конечно, не только жители Москвы, но в основном это были небезразличные жители Москвы. И история действительно уникальная, потому что я не знаю, чтобы какой-то другой проект по фактически аудиту идей и проектов мэрии финансировался самими жителями, которые решили пригласить независимых международных экспертов, чтобы они дали свое заключение по поводу того, что их делает их родная мэрия. История очень хорошая, интересная, уникальная в своем роде, и теперь мы можем вести дискуссию по транспортным проблемам уже совершенно на другом уровне. У нас есть сильные аргументы, и сейчас Максим Кац, один из вдохновителей, он на самом деле весь этот проект придумал, вел его, больше всех за него переживал, всеми командовал. И сейчас он расскажет поподробнее по экспертному совету, потому что он его формировал, общался с этими людьми. Сейчас он расскажет, почему так произошло, и дальше мы заслушаем доклад.
Спасибо. У нас вообще вот и в городе, и в стране редко происходит что-то независимое. Когда вот собрались люди и решили, что нужно узнать что-то вот честно, объективно. Да? У нас в основном анализы это когда анализатору, анализирующему заранее говорят, какой должен быть исход. Проверка мнений жителей это когда заранее приводят тех жителей, которые скажут то, что надо, похлопают и проголосуют за. То есть редко можно увидеть что-то действительно объективное и независимое, когда специалисты приехали и без какого-либо давления от какой-либо из сторон, ну, практически без, анализируют какую-то крупную вещь, действительно важную, которая влияет на город и влияет на все, что происходит. И это первый такой случай, я надеюсь, что не последний. Мне очень нравится такая практика. Мне странно, что мэрия сама это не делает, потому что вообще-то, конечно, такие проекты должны финансироваться мэрией, а не жителями из кармана. И мэрия сама должна проверять, правильно ли она действует или нет, если она делает какие-то крупномасштабные проекты. Но пока у нас это не всегда так, и вот мы с вами и с другими людьми, которых тут нет, скинулись деньгами, пригласили двух крупнейших специалистов в мире для того, чтобы они проанализировали, что же у нас тут происходит с транспортной политикой. А ведь транспортный бюджет города, программы городской на развитие транспортной инфраструктуры, это 1 триллион 156 миллиардов рублей за 3 года. И вообще-то важно, куда и как эти деньги тратятся, и что именно на эти деньги строится. Строится ли то, что город улучшит, или строится ли то, что город ухудшит. Никогда, в общем-то, такой дискуссии нигде я не слышал. Я слышал только дискуссию, как именно мы будем компенсировать вырубленное дерево здесь, посаженным деревом там, в каком-то очень локальном уровне, а хочется обсудить это в целом. И вот, как мне кажется, нам более-менее удалось рассмотреть ситуацию в целом. Я сейчас хочу объявить и зачитать тех, кто участвовал в этом проекте, потому что, мне кажется, это важно. Большая команда занималась его организацией. Значит, это Вукан Вучик, профессор. Тур Хотвайт. Профессор Жан-Клод Зив. К сожалению, профессор Жан-Клод Зив скончался неделю назад. И из-за обострения тяжелой болезни он участвовал в этом проекте, и он писал некоторые его части, и до последнего момента писал мне смс-ки, что вот он надеется выздороветь и приехать поучаствовать, он очень хотел в этом участвовать, но вот, к сожалению, так получилось, что он не смог. Дальше. Иван Васин, консультант, Илья Петушков, консультант, Антон Буслов, консультант, и Юрий Оралов. Это группа транспортных консультантов, которая помогала нам провести людей по городу и показать им, как и здесь что происходит, а также дать общее представление о исторической ситуации с транспортом. Евгений Решетнев, Алексей Грибов, Антон Мараст, Павел Еремин. Это дизайнеры, которые делали этот доклад, который можно посмотреть. Николай Андреев, это переводчик, который вот там сейчас высоко в будке и переводит вам в ухо. Нет, вам пока не переводит. Значит, Алексей Фельдгендлер, это другой переводчик, который был в прошлый раз. Евгений Кудряшов, редактор. Координаторы проекта Елена Марус, Ирина Правниченко, Наталья Пушкарева, Алексей Свирин, Екатерина Фефилова. Без него точно ничего не получилось. Елена Доронкина занималась организацией пресс-конференции, студии «Наизнанку», Павел Поляков, Андрей Жилин, фотографы и кинооператоры, Анна Бирюкова помогала в организации мероприятий. Спасибо команде Яндекса, архитектурному музею имени Щусева, коллективу этой библиотеки, Андрею Теплякову и его мастерской, а также волонтерам городских проектов, которые постоянно помогали и в этом мероприятии, и во всех предыдущих. Ну и, конечно, тем, кто жертвовал деньги. Более 2000 человек пожертвовал. Это беспрецедентная совершенно история, я думаю, в мире, чтобы люди скидывались таким образом и приглашали людей для анализа транспортных проектов. Большое спасибо всем. Я ухожу, передаю слово Вукану Вучику и Туру Хотвайту.
Спасибо большое, Макс. Очень приятно быть здесь, и я не могу говорить по-русски, so I'll have to change to English. Okay, yes. Do I need this in addition? Yeah? Okay. All right. Well, as you all know, sorry. Somewhere here, right? Okay. As you all know, in Moscow and in other Russian cities, there are lots of transportation developments and transportation problems. Whenever I come, and I've been here several times, I get questions, how should we get rid of congestion, pробки, how long, how much money will it take, how do we do that, and so on. And I sometimes hear, well, Moscow is unique in this problem, and it happens so rapidly, and so on. Actually, Moscow is not anything unusual. The same development happened in all cities when they got rapid increase in automobile ownership. And at once many cars came to the streets which were designed for either pedestrians in 19th century or for horse carts in the 20th century or transit vehicles. So the same problem occurred, the same questions occurred, And very similar attitudes occurred. If you have a congested street, well, the government should do something. That means widen the streets and build more parking. How did that go? Well, we feel that we can help you here, first by explaining what happened in cities, in many cities, most cities, when this happened, and how some cities did some measures, and they were wrong measures, and they made big mistakes, and what was the result? Was that the city got downgraded, destroyed, was not more livable. It was very inefficient, and so on. Some other cities took the different point of view. They did studies how to solve this problem, and some of them, an increasing number of cities now, is leading in solutions of these complex problems of transportation in very large cities. Coming back to our visit here and our report, the main cause for this report was that you have two major projects being planned or being underway. One is the Ленинский prospect reconstruction, and the other one is Northwest Horda corridor. We analyzed those two, but we had to take a broader view and to review also how other cities did the planning at the corresponding stage when the traffic congestion was increasing, public transport came into crisis, policies toward one and the other mode were confused, and so on. So we want to show you, we want a brief discussion of what was the process in those cities, what they have learned, which cities did not succeed and which cities did succeed. So we then focus somewhat on these two corridors, and we conclude then with various conclusions and recommendations about these two corridors, and hopefully some of our conclusions are transferable to other corridors in Moscow or in St. Petersburg or in many other Russian cities. The first question is, what is the transportation situation in Moscow today? How is it? How is the situation? And we see an excellent metro system, which is doing a great job. Without that metro, of course, there could not exist Moscow. It's a blood circulation system for Moscow. That is being expanded now, and we fully agree with that policy. We think that with the city growing and with the importance of metro to be independent of congestion and so on is very great, and you have to expand the metro considerably. We have a problem of congestion of streets, and is that serious? It's uncomfortable that we sit in that car, in our car or taxi or so, and we cannot move. But it's much more than that. If you have such a condition, you cannot be reliably at a meeting where you want to go. You may be late for your meeting, late for your concert, late for your school, and whatever it is. So it really affects the city very seriously. Very seriously. The congestion is an irrational situation, and we really have to look how to create a system which is not which does not suffer from continuous congestion. How do we make the city more livable? Now, when I mention livable cities, it's a nice word, but can we define that a little bit more? Well, livable city, we call the city which is economically viable and vital, which has social relations which are good, not great differences by either race or by income or any other way. so socially reasonably stable, and environmentally and with quality of life also in satisfactory level. Those are the three major ones, but we put that together as a livability of city or quality of life in the city. We also in recent years have been talking about another concept, and that's sustainability. What is sustainability? It's livability with the time dimension, that we want such and such quality of city, and then that remains like that, that we are not destroying it. And we define sustainability as Brundtland defined it officially, that we leave the city in a condition not worse than what we found when our lives started. So we are discussing the condition of the city and impacts of the property. So we have, next one. We have metro, as I showed. We have then here tramway, trolleybus and bus, which we call наземный transport, right? Общественный наземный transport, which is in many places it's covering the city very well, but really in recent years it has suffered greatly. Why? Because it is caught in пробка. So it's less attractive to use. It offers lower speed and reliability than it did 20 and 30 years ago. Also, some of your systems are obsolete. Tramway is from 1950s by its concept, by its regulation. It has no signals for priority. It is treated like any other vehicle, and so on. The city is now undertaking steps to modernize that and to upgrade it into light rail transit, легкий рельсовый transport. That's a system that is very modernized and differently designed. It is so different from tramway that it's closer to metro than to old-fashioned tramway. So we see that the наземный общественный transport is not doing so well because it's suffering from пробка, and you can see that on Tverskaya or any of these streets. If you see, especially in the peak hour, look inside, there are virtually no passengers. Why? Because whoever can, he drives and will not change to the bus, which is in the same congestion or even slower. So the problem is that public transport cannot compete with the automobile when it's caught in that congestion. And the solution to that would be that we have more and more transit systems separated from other traffic. You have some of the bus lanes, but especially light rail transit is easier to separate and to maintain that separation and higher quality of service. Then we have, next one, and next one, parking. Well, when I came first time in Moscow about 10 years ago, it was an absolute chaos. I mean, cars were parked on pedestrian crossings and at the corners, at intersections, anywhere. And nobody was paying anything to it, and so on. So, in our report, we keep emphasizing parking, which sometimes some people think that's a separate function, how people park and to whom they pay and so on. No, it's a part of the entire system of transportation, and it's a very important element in our operations and in influencing how many people will come by car, how many will come by transit. We call it modal split. So parking should be a part of the transportation system, and we mentioned that this is a big problem, that unpaid parking makes it even economically, public transport, it comes out nearly cheaper, more expensive than private car, which is absurd. I was delighted when I landed 2 days ago in Moscow and they said parking charges are starting. And I think that's a big step forward, and I'm sure the city will proceed with that, and that's an important element of progress. Next one is that sometimes the cars are allowed to park even on sidewalks, on trottoirs, and the small number of cars displaces many pedestrians. This is one of the elements that really decreases the livability of the city. It becomes car dominated and not very pleasant. Next. We're then discussing what should be done and what should be invested into highways and what should be invested into public transportation to upgrade and modernize light rail, trolleybus, and bus. Next. There are many things, and I will not go in detail, but for example, in many cities where there is light rail transit, for example, one line in Bergen in Norway, fairly small city, 150,000, built a beautiful light rail line. At every intersection, as the car comes, it gets green. So it continuously goes, and speed is greater, reliability is greater, and so on. That kind of preferential treatment at signals for transit, be it light rail or trolleybus or bus, you don't have it yet in the country. So that is one of the things that can be and must be introduced, because just think logically, does it make sense that cars which carry 1,2 persons on the average, we treat it the same way as a bus which carries 35 people, or trolleybus, or articulate trolleybus, 100 people, and light rail, which, if it's a longer train, can carry 250 people. Why do we count vehicles? Do we drive vehicles to get vehicles there or people? So we should really favor public transportation. That's very logical. Okay, next one is some of these vehicles which have a right-of-way here on your streets. That's more common than in any other country that I've seen, and that should be regulated differently, or if Propke get reduced, that there will be less need for that kind of favor. Next. Well, we had great changes in transportation in cities. We were mostly walking, and first cars came, and then came an era of transit use, and now in some cities, if we are not careful, cars begin to dominate, and that's not a very good development. Next. As I said, logically, people began to say, if we have congestion, let's build more highways. So we built wider streets, and then divided streets, and then separated streets, and elevated streets, and so on. A new concept came, and that is so-called motorway or freeway or autoroute in French, and that is the highway which has all access controlled, only cars coming by ramps and getting off by ramps. And I was quite surprised that you really don't have even a term that clearly designates that kind of highway. And we had some problems in writing this report. How do we refer? Because sometimes people think highway is that great separator. Highway in English is any highway. So we sometimes mention freeway. Freeway means there is no intersection. This is one of the dilemmas. What do we build? We need more highways, and if we have a city that is developing in a certain direction, we can design these. In a built-up city, we have a problem. What do? Sometimes we find places where the road will be designed, sometimes we cannot. So you are facing the problem that Moscow has somewhat interesting two cases. Narrow streets, which are sometimes, about 10 meters wide road, parking allowed on both sides, and two-way traffic. That just does not work. There is no space, and it's congested all the time. So you really have to do something in regulation on that to solve that problem. On the other hand, you have a huge number of avenues, boulevards, or what you call prospect. Those are huge areas, very nice, very spacious, very well designed at the time when they were designed. They also were designed with some green areas, with some parking, with some deliveries, and then came cars, and then angle parking started, and so on. But they are rather disorderly, and the proposals are to rebuild and modernize some of those prospects. In that case, we agree that some of those prospects should be redesigned. It's only a question, how do you redesign it, and what are the affected parties, and how do you go about it? So, and then in some cities, some of the elevated highways are built. This can be done along the river or industrial area or green area and so on. But if you build an elevated highway in a street, in a narrow street, you cannot. It's just not acceptable. In a wide street you can, but you have to be careful about the impacts and how you handle that, because there is a conflict between a high capacity, high speed highway and buildings and people who live there and work there and so on. And that's the problem in designing that. Okay, next. No, you jumped one over. Can you go? Yeah. I already mentioned the paying for parking is really a big step forward, and the purpose of that is not so much to get the money. The purpose of that is to limit the duration of parking, use it by more people, and then make some improvements related to that and having some funds for that. But parking charges, some people immediately say, oh, this is a public surface, it should not be charged, and so on. This is a public facility, doesn't mean it should not be charged for. It doesn't mean at all. And even the parkers who are driving cars, I think that they will very soon be very happy with it, because they'll notice that they have to pay, but they'll have much more spaces available. They will not have to spend 20 or 30 minutes just cruising the streets and trying to find some space. So it's a control of that, and of course with the rates that you are using, you can adjust what the demand is. So this has been a big step. The next step, though, will be also so-called road user charges. And that is the concept that you charge cars for driving into center city, either from 7 to 10 in the morning and sometime in the afternoon, or the whole day, or at several places, and so on. There are many different concepts, many different arrangements, and many different uses of the revenue obtained. But road user charges, it may be early for you now. All the new concepts, you are skeptical and people don't understand them well and so on. But if you don't start discussing that, you will just delay that, and there is a need for that. I'll come back to that toward the end of my talk. So that's where we are now in Moscow, with serious problem of congestion, with very similar problems that parking made in Vienna 50 years ago, in Rome and Naples. Total flood of cars hiding the historic monuments, and in Salzburg you couldn't see Mozart there because there were cars all around it. Now you go there, there's no parking. It's all regulated differently. Trains it uses, city has been redesigned, and so on. So that is something that we want to discuss and help. On the other hand, you have made already some steps forward in the relationship and driving culture. You already have now on some pedestrian crossings that cars stop and let you cross. I don't think 5 or 8 years ago you would have dared to do that. You would have been killed. So you go through maturity and through discussion of this. We have had an interview on the radio today, and we mentioned, and they asked us, how do we get support of the public? And that is very important. You cannot, if the public doesn't understand, it's very difficult to introduce charges, limitations, investments, and all of this. And therefore, it's important to explain the background, to show how historically other cities did and what were the results and which were good results, which were bad results. So with that background, we began to analyze the situation in Moscow and then focus on these 2 corridors. I'll give it now to Mr. Хотвайт.
Do we as foreigners have an answer for all their problems in Moscow? No. Each city has to find its own solutions. But the interesting thing is that we are quite often doing many of the same mistakes, while many of the good solutions seem to elude us. And it's quite natural, because if you have a big problem and you think you can see the solution, you think the solution is quite close, you feel very tempted to go for that solution. Sometimes it is, if you have lots of queues on your roads, well, it's logical to expand the capacity and provide more space for more vehicles, of course. But then, what is the difference between short-term solutions and long-term solutions? What if those expansions you're making on some parts of the network, what if those, what you think is improvements, what happens in a few years ahead? Are those improvements good for the city? And many cities have found out that some of those things we did were actually not that good, which makes the decision making a little bit more complicated. Because whenever you make a short-term solution, you always have to think long-term. And none of us are very good at seeing the future, so we are a bit uncertain. But at least we can try. And many cities have been successful and learned of their mistakes. What are the mistakes? Well, I think that one of them is that we are not counting the whole transportation system. We feel tempted to look at just parts of it. By solving one part, we solve one problem, and we are quite happy for a little while. But those cities that are actually improving the quality of life in their cities, they are looking at all the different parts of the transit system. And as I said a little bit earlier today, I used to drive to work every day in my car. And I did that for some years. Today, I use my car once a week and never to work. And I'm wondering if I could drop my car. Maybe I don't need it. So what has happened? Well, the city has done quite a few things where I live. For one thing, they're not providing any more parking spaces. But there are always available parking spaces, but I have to pay quite a bit to get to it, which is fine for me, because those very few times I need my car to the center city, I know that I will always find a parking space without any trouble. What happened with the queues to downtown? It used to be quite a few queues, and I was participating to those. Well, those queues some places they have gone. One reason for that is that the city is charging an amount of money to entering the city by car. So that means that using the car to the center of the city is not longer attractive. So again, we see that the short-term problem, you can solve it in different ways. You can build more capacity, but you can also maybe dampen the demand for car capacity and use public transport as an alternative. So there is a concept illustrated by this picture. It's called vicious circle. If you keep building more roads, if you keep providing more parking spaces, it will be more attractive to use your car. And people are leaving their bus, or they're leaving their tram, and leaving the metro, and they walk over to their car and use a car because it's much faster to use a car. And the traffic increases on the car network, on the road network. What about those that have been using a car for a long time? If they see a lot of new people coming to their network with new cars, well, as long as you keep building highways, fine, it's no problem. But if you cannot keep up the speed by people transferring from public transport to cars, then you have a problem, because then the queues are coming back and it takes more and more time to use public transport. At the same time, public transport they are carrying less and less people, so you cannot expect one bus going every 10 minutes if less and less people use it. So maybe one bus every 15 minutes, or maybe once every half an hour. That's a vicious circle. People are leaving one mode of transport, going to another, and the whole process starts over and over again. You need all the time to build more and more. But you can reverse it, you can do the other thing, and that's what's happening in many places in Europe. You are actually making public transport better. You are having people going from their car back to public transport. Those that still has to drive cars, they are very happy. They see that, okay, now the traffic is moving again, because so many people are using public transport. Next, please. So it's an illustration of spending money, a lot of money on one mode means that you're spending, of course, less money on the alternatives. It could be for pedestrians, it could be for public transportation, it could be for all those alternatives. My city has about the same winter problems like you have. We have a long winter and it's cold and it's lousy. But people are using bikes, even in the winter. That is completely new. Nobody used to take a bike to their work or to somewhere, not in the winter. Now they are using bikes. Not that many, but it's a tremendous increase in bike traffic and pedestrian traffic in the summer, and there is also something of that is spilling over in wintertime, which is interesting. Nobody thought it would be possible. So spending money on the alternatives to cars and highways pays off. You can imagine the cost for expanding a big important road. If you can reduce that need to do that by improving public transportation, fine. Then you have saved some money that you can use on more alternative or more sustainable solutions. Yeah. But again, each city has to face that kind of problem from the beginning. Los Angeles, as we see here, they had, I think it was the most extensive tram network in the world.
No, Western United States.
Western United States, the largest rail-bound system. And all of it was replaced by cars and buses. Now Los Angeles are rebuilding public transportation and they are reintroducing tramways. I have been in cities in Europe that has done exactly the same thing. In Strasbourg, in France, they were building a new light rail system. I saw the tracks from their old tramway system that was abandoned 30 years earlier. And that kind of reducing the service level for public transportation forced exactly these cities to move to a car-oriented development. Yes, one more. And what we see today is that many of these cities have suffered both economically and also environmentally, because large parts of the city has been, people have moved away from the city, and they are putting the activities other places, which is very sad. Even if it's a theater, it's a cinema, it's a restaurant, you can see all these are closed and moved to other places. Then the city has lost something important. So if we are going to try to reverse this development, we have to think in another way. Just as a car driver that is purchasing his first car, everything about that new car is important. The seats, the color, the size. You're very occupied about how that new car will be. And the good smell of a new car is fantastic. Well, those same people are also using public transportation. And of course, we should provide all the same qualities for a trip if you use public transportation. So the example that Dr. Vучik mentioned a little earlier from my country, from Bergen, they had abandoned light or streetcars or trams. That was lost in the 60s. They have reintroduced light rail, and the quality of the new public transport system is very, very good. People that used to drive are already going to use light rail. They're using light rail much more than we thought they would. The same is happening in Paris. Paris has an excellent metro, just like Moscow. Also a very extensive bus network. But again, to increase the quality of the transport system, they are supplementing buses and the metro by light rail. And as you see on this picture, they've used this opportunity to also increase the livability in the streets. It's like a park. These light rail vehicles, they run on grass, which makes them silent and which makes the whole area very pleasant. Next. Berlin has also reintroduced trams many places. They had an extensive tram network. All that has been modernized. Just like Moscow, the standard on the system was not good. After 1990, it has been upgraded and is now of very high quality, which means that the trams are running on time. You know that you get a space on the tram. You don't have to wait for the next one, and you get from A to B in a short time. Lyon, the same story. In all these places, not only the high standard, but also the network, the connections, so that the whole public transport network works just as seamless as the road network. Driving a car, you can choose any new direction you want in any intersection. Fine. With public transport, it's not that simple. Sometimes you have to walk quite a bit. Other times you have to go down in a tunnel and come up from another tunnel far away and high up. It's difficult to change from one mode to another. That can be done much more simple. Next. So by doing all these steps for the whole transport system, building new roads, but at the same time doing good things for public transportation, then you can reduce the area required for car driving and car parking, and you can give a little bit of the city back to people. And this situation you have in Russia and you have in many European countries. And we want that to continue. Next. And how we do that is very simple. You have a diagram here. One light rail vehicle has the same capacity as 2 large buses, articulated buses, or 3 standard buses. And you choose any of these modes according to your need. Sometimes bus is good, other times you want trolleybus, and other times light rail. But each of these represents 180 cars. And just imagine all the space you need to provide capacity for those 180 cars on a road network and for parking. If you're driving one light rail vehicle every 5 minutes, then you have to provide 180 cars capacity for those every 5 minutes too. And that's the reason why those streets and roads get full very quickly. So instead, many cities are going the other way, and they are building more and more spaces for livable cities, for pedestrians, for bicyclists, and bringing qualities back to the center of the city. I heard that the most expensive place in Europe to rent a space for selling goods, that's in Bahnhofstrasse in Zurich, in Switzerland. You have to pay an enormous amount to rent space to sell things, shop space. How does Bahnhofstrasse look like? Well, like this, but with light rail. It's only light rail and pedestrians. Some streets are allowed for parking and for driving, but it's very limited. We are not closing the city for cars, of course not. The city needs cars, but you don't need the high volume of cars. Yeah. So, what is the right thing to do? I think the most important thing is to find the right balance between public transportation and car transport. In a big city like Moscow, you have to provide capacity for quite a bit of traffic with cars. Of course, you need highways, you need freeways, you need parking. But you can regulate it. You can plan it together with public transportation. You can find a balance that's working good and that is not destroying the fabric of the city. In that way, by using all the different elements of public transportation and put that together with the highway network, you will get a good total solution, which is useful. And that's exactly what we are proposing, that you go very detailed into what are the elements, what are the improvements we can do for public transportation. You take mode by mode. Metro, you have a world-class metro, but maybe there are some few things that can still be improved. Trams, yes, they can be improved quite a bit. You have a 1950 style of tram. Let's get it up to 2013 at least. And so on. There are so many things you can do. And let's try those things. If possible, before you build roads, but at least at the same time, in order to not let people go back to their cars and use the car network. Let's keep them for public transportation as long as we can and stimulate people to go from the cars and over to public transportation. Then the traffic moves a little better on the highways. Then I think I give the word back to you.
So we call this modal split, how people choose modes. And we know that some people will drive cars whatever happens. Either they like it or they need by their duty, or it's family, they have to take children and so on. Another number of people will use transit either before they prefer it, or they don't have a car, or they don't drive. We are talking then about maybe 20% here, 20% here, but 60% in the middle. Where do we take them? And that really would make a huge difference in the city. And the cities in the United States in 1960s, even the planners saw the automobile is the only future. Transit is only for poor people. Pedestrians, nobody walks in America. We are a movable nation. Such simplistic, wrong concepts guided some cities to do everything for the car. And as the cities were made totally auto-dependent, they really went into crisis. Their livability went down. That one picture from Detroit, there are no people in the streets of Detroit, and so on. Now, how do we influence this modal split? How do we influence these 60%? And by the way, that percent is not the same. The larger is the city, the larger you must make it for public transport, and you can make it for public transport. And really, large, well-designed cities have transit dominating, in the sense that if you are in New York, if you are in Paris, you are much better off if you don't have the car than if you have the car. But how do we talk people into going from cars to transit? We have to analyze how people decide that, and people will not go only for ideology. They believe in livable cities. You have to create conditions for them, and that means we have to discourage people from using cars by having some charges like parking charges and road user charges and taxes and so on. But when you squeeze people out of cars, if they don't have good transit, they say, what, I have no mobility, this city is becoming worse. At the same time, we have to provide public transport which is much better and very attractive. So that's because if we have say on a major street in the city, if we have 2,000 persons per hour driving, and we also have a metro line, if we would move a couple of hundred people from the cars to the metro, what would happen? Metro would have more riders, would be more economical, provide more frequent service, and so on. So we would gain on the transit system. What about cars? We would also gain, because 1,800 cars would go faster and more reliably than 2,000 cars. So the shift from cars to transit is a win-win situation. The opposite happens if we lose people from transit, put them in the cars. Okay, so now let's get back to Moscow here. And we, as I mentioned, street transit is in difficult problems. Sometimes it's difficult for vehicles even to come to the curb, to be convenient to transfer, and so on. Next. And then in congestion, reliability of service and unpleasant travel and so on are typical. So we focused then on these two projects. And first was the Ленинский project, Ленинский prospect. And we said, let's analyze, this is a multi-goal project. We have several interested parties. We have one party which is driving cars mostly through that area, from Gagarin all the way to MCAD or something like that. Another group of people is driving but coming to and from that area. They're more local, they need more stops and so on, and they're not so much for high speed. The third category are transit riders. How would they be affected by this project? Did this project accommodate them well? And then come people who are living in that area and who are living, residing or purchasing or going to schools and medical institutions and so on. So we have all these groups. And we have to see, whatever we design, how is each group affected, because in many ways we have to make a trade-off between one and the other. The more cars we put on a high-speed traffic, high-speed lanes, the more impact, negative impact, is on the livability of the region. The more we constrain, we put more livability for people, the more we have to reduce somewhat or limit somewhat the volume of cars, and so on. Next. We do have, no, next. Yeah. We do have this problem. How do you build a high-capacity highway through the city? Generally, a principle in planning is that if you have a center city or some outside development with strong activities, dense activities, how do we design highways to go around that and feed from the sides? And we discourage driving through that. The center should be more pedestrian oriented and so on. Some cities even regulate that they make the center where you cannot go through at all. In Gothenburg you divide the city and so on. How do we plan transit lines? Well, the principle in transit lines, in alignment, is that they should go right into the core of that area, because that is pedestrian oriented and you want to tie pedestrians with public transport, be it trolleybus or be it metro, whatever it is. So if we have these two functions, then we have some problems. How do we reconcile, how do we control the highway character and human and other local activities character. Next. This is today Ленинский prospect. The plan for it is that between Gagarin and MCAD there should be 3+3 lanes without any signals, and at major intersections it goes under or it goes over, and only turning movements go around and make left turns and right turns. There would be also side roads similar to now, but more lanes added, because from those roads there would be acceleration ramps and then weaving section between those entering cars and exiting cars and so on. So the number of lanes would be increased from 10 or 12 now to maybe 14 or 16 in the future. What about transit? Well, we are not happy with what we see about transit, in that the bus lines and trolleybus lines that are crossing each other, they all have stops maybe 300 meters away from the intersection, which means if you want to change from east-west bus to north-south bus, you have to walk half a kilometer to get from one to the other and cross many streets. That is not coordinated network. And then it is mentioned that one of the high-speed lanes, no, one of the lanes on the side roads would be a bus lane. Now, we have had many bus lanes in the States and in other countries. And some of them, if you control them, design them well, they work. But many of them have had various compromises. What is the compromise? I think you already experienced some. That you have a bus lane, exclusive, but on Saturday and Sunday, it's not a bus lane. Which means if you may have heavy traffic, your bus will again be stuck. You will lose the bus service. Then there is pressure that you allow their taxis, and then come the turning vehicles, then sometimes electric vehicles, sometimes motorcycles. So stepwise, you very often lose those bus lanes, and the worst thing is that we transportation people say this is how it should be, but then the city council or some political body may decide, oh, we should allow these and these vehicles in. So we give that to the layman to dictate then, and we have lost many bus lanes in the United States, just they became general lanes. There was a proposal for a light rail line on Ленинский. We have heard about it. We have heard some very supportive opinions by competent people. We've heard also some opinions that that was tried, it would be too expensive and so on. We are not at all convinced that that was studied to sufficient depth. And one of our recommendations is that they should analyze the possibility for light rail line, which could be a demonstration of a modern light rail system in Moscow here. And next, yeah, these are the interchanges and highways in the countryside. But here is totally different, and that's why we are somewhat skeptical about this increase of number of lanes and 6 high-speed lanes. And if they come to Gagarin or they come to MCUD, we may have a bottleneck. And the bottleneck is the problem. That's what creates the Probka. The mention is also that, next one. The mention is that we may be able to control the number of cars getting into center city. And for that case, we are also suggesting, why don't we consider, if you want to keep these 2 lanes, 2+2 lanes, non-signalized lanes, we should have maybe 2x2, it will be enough, rather than 3x3. The capacity would still be about the same. So we are suggesting some of these improvements to the project. We also are not convinced that the estimation of dispersal of traffic when it comes to Gagarin has been done sufficiently. There has been an excellent simulation model, looks nice, but if you do look at the picture, you do see that it's heavily highway dominated, and that's what many people living in that area are disagreeing with and criticizing. Next. Yeah, this would be a modern light rail transit as compared to the old model. Next. The stops, and then you have to walk a long way and cross streets and so on to get to another stop, is not very convenient. It should be coordinated stops and close transfers among different vehicles and lines. Next. So this could be a modern light rail transit. There was not much attention given to the bicycles, and for pedestrians there are some concerns, and we are suggesting more attention to that. That's not that cannot be done. I think they can review that and adjust the project. So that's why we're giving these suggestions. We support the concept of rebuilding prospects and redesigning them, but we feel in this case, and even more so in Horda, that it was designed with primary attention just to have high capacity of cars, and the other concerned parties like transit users and people living there and so on were not treated well enough, and that should be reevaluated and revised. Next. Okay. Technically, those lanes look fine, but as I said, in practice, we considered that exclusive bus lane, we doubt its efficiency, and we think that the light rail possibility should be given much more attention. If we increase capacity on Ленинский, there will be some people from other parallel highways coming there, so we will increase the volume of traffic. And then if transit is not attractive, we'll get some people leaving transit and coming to cars. And then we have this change of mode from buses to cars, which is not only is not desirable, but it's really contrary to the policy of the city. And the city and Mayor Sobyanin has said we want to give priority to public transportation for many reasons, economic and livability and so on. Next. Yeah, these are our suggestions. Next. Then we looked into Horda, Northwest Horda, and it's a much more complex project. The recommendations are also more complex because some of it has been built or is being built and so on. So some of the changes may be made, some of them may not. The one thing that concerned us very much is that there has been an idea, and I understand that came from before, even from Mayor Lushkov, that he liked so-called elimination of signals or signal-free sections of the highway. And that is, if you want to build a really independent highway with space, then you build that highway. But in a street network where you have major streets with heavy traffic intersecting, you cannot work that without signals. There were ideas in 1930s that we could build all streets and highways with only right turns, and if we have a divided road, then instead of another one crossing, these people would go and make a right turn and go some distance and make a U-turn and then make another right turn. That's very complicated. It works in lightly traveled areas and so on. It does not work where you have very heavy traffic. So the problem occurred here that they have proposal for such treatment of intersections, and one of them is between Marshala Beryuzova and Narodного Opachenia. And Narodного Opachenia is a bigger highway, and they are trying to make that one without signals. So that the proposal is that in the median here, there should be a fence, a cross, so that turns cannot be made, or rather, that crossing traffic cannot go. That crossing traffic would have to merge here, go up far away and make a U-turn and come back and then go this way or that way. For the same from this side and so on. We don't think that that is technically feasible. The ideas of this continuous flow that were discussed and used somewhat in the state of New Jersey, in America and so on, are used only at lightly traveled places, but the proposals for that in big cities and heavy highways have not been successful. What upset us quite a bit is that what happens with the buses and trolleybuses crossing this. Buses and trolleybuses would have to make a right turn, go a long way and make a U-turn and come back. Now, and I know you have done that in Moscow at several places, and I think that that should never be considered, because the basic principle of designing transit lines is that they are as direct as possible, as comfortable and safe as possible, that the travel time should be as minimum as possible. If you give passengers that they have to go 1 kilometer, or in one case 4 kilometers, and then come back somewhere you don't want to go at all, that person will try to buy a car very soon, because this is not acceptable. So we are suggesting that that be reevaluated, and I hope we have some success in that, the whole concept should be reconsidered, and it's absolutely a result of this when you want to design everything for cars, and then at the end you add public transport as it could go and give it the most inconvenient routing that you can have. We even made a small analysis. If those buses would go around like that and come back, how much additional time they would have, but not time per trolleybus, time for passengers. And it turns out that that loss of travel time would be greater than what you would save for passenger cars to go straight through intersection or past the intersection without stopping. So we would really increase total travel time, and we would really increase it to transit and decrease to the automobile, which again goes against the city's policy of favoring public transport. So we have also several suggestions there. Next. Yeah, one more is that we should be very careful with these elevated highways, and if at all possible, not make them close to residential areas because of that conflict between the nature of the two facilities, the highway and the residential areas. Next. Yeah. What happens if you build these elevated highways? And you know, in some cases, you just didn't have much attention to that, and you built it, and everybody thought the car is the future, and that at one time that could be built. Tokyo has many of these freeways going through built-up areas quite close to the center, and they said, we know this is terrible. Well, we just had no other solution. We had to build some of them. In other cities, however, the criticism increased, and we, in many cities, tore down those elevated highways. We tore down in Boston, we tore down in Seoul, in Korea, we tore down in San Francisco, and San Francisco was more than just tearing down one. There was so much construction of all these freeways through cities and through the bodies of cities that San Francisco, which is a very proud city of its beauty, and really it is a remarkable city, and has green areas and fantastic Golden Gate Park, and they come with an 8-lane freeway to cut the park. By the way, if you ever heard about Hawaii and Waikiki Beach, famous beach, there was a plan for an elevated 6-lane highway to go 200 meters in the ocean in front of the beach. So you see, we had to go through that stage, and then we evaluate, and now we are trying to correct that by tearing down. In San Francisco, that freeway crossing the Golden Gate Park, that caused a what we call freeway revolt, revolution, and people just said, we do want to travel, but we don't want to live over and under highways, so stop that. And that rebellion then spread from city to city, and many cities, like my Philadelphia and Boston and New York had a plan to cross the entire Manhattan with 8-lane highway. All of those were eliminated from the plans. Around 1970 was this reevaluation and reduction and rapid increase for environmental aspects. That's why we are showing this here and saying, be careful, do not repeat some of our mistakes so that you have to tear down in 20 years. And we therefore suggest how they should improve this design. That's in Seoul. Now there was an elevated highway, and now it's a part of the city. Okay, I discussed the next. These are our suggestions. Next. We have to look at the treatment of all these groups, and we do notice that we have to pay more attention to the people living around the highway and to the people who are using transit around the highway, to prevent they have to leave transit and go to cars. Now, we are using this analysis of these two projects to list in some of our recommendations, hopefully a helpful list or methodology how to design these highways, not to take freeway and cars as absolutely governing, and then whatever we can do for the others. One has to look at each group parallel and make good, reasonable compromises between them. But we have a difficult fight, because until 2 days ago, some of you probably, if you would go to another place, to your work or to whatever place, if you have a parking there, if you catch a parking, then you count, oh, this is even cheaper than metro. because you only count direct money, what you're spending, and you are comparing that, and your cost is really minimal, and transit cannot compete with that very easily. Now you made a big first step with this parking charge, and regulation of parking will be a significant step forward, but it will not be enough, because you cannot charge enough for parking and so on. You have to charge also for different negative impacts which driving has, and to suppress the excessive driving in the city. How do you do that? Well, you must have heard about road user charges or electronic road pricing or such concepts. That was introduced in Singapore in 1975. That they said every car entering the city from 7 to 10 in the morning has to pay so and so much. And from that they increased into many of these facilities which detect vehicles and charge. And it's very interesting that they make surveys every 3 months. And if they see that the traffic is getting slower and slower, there is more congestion, they will increase the rate. So some people will give up, and your congestion will decrease. If the traffic is fast, they reduce the payment, because you can take some more cars. So you see, they are using that road pricing not only to create revenue, but to really prevent congestion. Because congestion, if you think about it, if somebody was looking at you at Tverskaya or any city, which every morning has 2 hours of people sitting in these machines, he would not think that those are very intelligent beings there. Well, what are we doing? So we want to find a way to regulate that. If we do not have those charges, we have a very difficult battle with a very cheap out-of-pocket driving, very expensive for the system and for the city, but people don't feel it. We have to translate that into various direct payments. And some countries are going one step more. These charges are discouraging you for driving too much. You think about how much you're spending and so on. Some of them see that the problem is that people are just buying cars more and more. And if you just compute how many cars there will be in your city in 5 or 10 years, you see that you cannot build enough highways. So that used to be in Singapore very strong. In Norway they have very high tax on purchasing cars. And now Shanghai and Beijing, and by the way, Beijing built quite a few highways, but still, they said we cannot keep up with this. And they have various methods of lottery, or you have to apply for owning a car and get it in 5 years, various ways of suppressing even ownership. If you don't suppress ownership, in America, some families with 4 persons, they have 3 or 4 cars. It's just endless, and driving is just not controlled. So this long term has to be applied to discourage ownership and limit their use in the cars. Otherwise, in the cities, because we have to think ahead. And talking about how do you get public support, we have to think more and more about what our goal is. Is our goal mobility, to travel as fast as possible to as many places as possible? No, there is something higher than that. And that higher is that our Moscow is livable. It's pleasant. It's not only focused on physical movement as fast and as far as possible. That people who are buying a house 50 kilometers from here, if they have to drive in, we better charge them, because they impose a lot of space, noise, safety problems, and so on. So this livability is the main goal, and you should, whenever you discuss and you should talk to people and explain that our sustainability and our belief that our Moscow is nice and should remain human and increase its human touch, historic touch. Your monuments. I just took a picture with Tchaikovsky today because I love him. So I was passing by, I took a picture today of myself with him. So there is a charm, there is something, and St. Petersburg the same, and many cities in Russia. You have to think about that. And I'll tell you that if you go to the cities which have been very successful in these two policies and in designing balanced transportation system, and that is Munich and Zurich and Stuttgart and Vancouver in Canada and Singapore and so on, when you talk to them, people on the street will show more understanding about the future, about the environment, about livability, about our city being world city where people like to come. In some other cities, which say, well, congestion is something that comes with the use of cars. People love cars, so we cannot do anything. Those cities don't have even expertise to understand this. So you have to work on really explaining to people, explaining basically the main goal is your big city, and within that, our transportation systems should be, as I discussed, and that is a big task also, and as you see, technically, it's not just build this and build that, you have to see what influences what. That brings me to the end, but I would like to mention that it is very positive that I see here, especially Gorodsky Проекты group, which enthusiastically works on these problems of today, and it has an impressive group of young people who are working very hard and doing surveys, doing measurements, finding things where it should be done, and so on. And such groups can be many times very constructive. I'm excluding some extremists who are against everything, who are against change, extremists who are in all kinds of things, or environmentalists who sometimes come in San Francisco. We couldn't build the rapid transit where it would have been much more efficient because of some snail living in some corner somewhere there. So those are extreme groups. But here I'm finding an enthusiastic, competent group really interested in helping the city and helping the government and trying to cooperate and assist. So I've appreciated the invitation they gave me, and I enjoy working with them, and I am glad to see that they are working on explaining to the broader audience, broader citizenship of Moscow, and hopefully what Moscow does improves and so on will influence other Russian cities also. So again, thank you for the invitation to come here and for this project, and I hope that this will be useful, and at this time we'll be glad to entertain any questions from you. Thank you.
Сейчас вопросы. Я буду подходить с микрофоном, то поближе, то подальше. Давайте, поднимайте руку, кто хочет задать вопрос первый. Начнем с поближе.
Я благодарю, что мне предоставили слово. Вопрос у меня такой. Значит, вот, в ваших проектах, предложениях, выводах сказано, что нужно строить цветные магистрали. Как вот быть в случае, если в одном, ну вот в Москве строится такая магистраль, или тем или иным образом будет построена, а в другом регионе, в Московской области, в данный момент даже полочком не забили, где строить эту магистраль, она только нарисована.
You mean Moscow and the expanded new area of Moscow? Or no. Right. Okay. So, well, in the outer areas, transportation planning should be done ahead. And as always in good planning, you go with land use, that's city planning and transportation planning. And if you are building such areas with higher density, you should immediately design high capacity transportation system. I saw coming from Sheremetyevo the area, what is this, Himmel, the area with high density? Himkin. Huge area with buildings, but it doesn't have any rail transit, any metro. I think that they are planning some rail systems, but if you build that and do not provide transportation, you have a problem. You have a problem. Inside the city, you'll have to improve efficiency and improve, for example, improvement of separation of наземный общественный transport will attract people to that. Metro lines will be built, and some of them will be built now at shallower stations to be more attractive. And you just do the best you can, but you try, not only try, but we really avoid tearing down big buildings or building parking garages all around Kremlin or something like that. And how you control that is then by parking charges and road user. You reduce the demand. So you have to play with that.
I think it was a problem with the translation. If I understood the question right, he asked how do you support projects of building highways inside the city if nothing is built outside the city yet? I understood right?
Ideally, you should have left places, corridors for right-of-way of future. But I understand that you had some of those rights-of-way, and then about 10 years ago or so, they built some high-rise buildings, so you lost it. Well, that's a mistake that is very difficult. You should have and find the green areas which you can still, or empty areas that you can use. But if you don't have them, you just have to suppress then the volume of traffic and shift to public transport. Yeah.
Спасибо вам. Во-первых, вопрос такой. Вы говорили о том, какие улучшения можно предложить для двух проектов, которые рассматривали. Если там чуть переформулировать вопрос, в текущем виде можно сказать, что какой-то из этих проектов или оба скорее негативный для городской среды, для транспорта, чем позитивный? Или это слишком резко и слишком комплексная ситуация?
Yes, especially in Horda, this sending buses and trolleybuses around is, in my opinion, totally unacceptable, and that should be corrected. In Ленинский, I think if we suggest studying modern light rail, and we think that is absolutely feasible to do, and if the study shows that it's feasible to build, then we are all for it. So, but at this time, the way the projects are, we suggest that they're not adequate in that respect, but we suggest exactly what should be done to make it acceptable. Yes.
Спасибо за презентацию, спасибо за возможность задать вопрос. У меня два небольших вопроса. Первый – это такой, вы встречались уже с московскими официальными лицами, какой фидбэк вы от них получили? То есть они разделяют какое-то понимание вообще ваших идей? Это первый вопрос. И второй вопрос. Вот вы приводили пример о том, как в других городах и странах власти доходили до того, что меняли кардинально проект, то есть убирали хайвей, делали на это пешеходную зону или там река у вас была на картинке. Что служило катализатором для таких изменений? Спрос со стороны населения, давление, там, протесты, выборы, и вообще как власть доходила до такого, чтобы изменить? Спасибо.
I'll answer the first, you answer the second, okay? Yes, we have been in touch from time to time with the city officials, and we found agreements in many things and disagreements in some others. We are expressing desire that if we criticize something, that it's a constructive criticism. We suggest what should be done rather than destructive, just trying to stop. But we did have, especially with the principles that the city has announced, the priority for public transport, the concern for environmental aspects, all kinds of statements. We are 100% behind it. We think you are very progressive on that policy. The problem is between that policy and actual project is in this case not satisfactory yet, and we are suggesting how the project should be improved to be more in line with the city's policies.
Just adding my comment to that, it's a matter of timing. If we had been sitting here for 2 years ago, of course we would have given more practical input to, for example, the Horda project, also the Ленинский project. But we are here today, and the government officials, I believe they are doing the best out of the situation and what they can do. So some things might be changed, and we applaud that. Other things may be a bit too late to change. But what we're saying, maybe it can be used for next time. There are many projects waiting, and our comments may be valid for those projects. With respect to what made people or cities, other cities change, instead of building roads and parking, suddenly started to build parks and other facilities. It's a gradual process. It's a learning process.
How did you change in Oslo?
In Oslo, we changed. It was popular support for building good areas to live. So that means that instead of filling the cars into the city, we wanted the cars out of the city. We built some very expensive projects where the through traffic in the city was placed under the sea. We have a fjord going all the way into center city. We didn't have space for building more capacity, so that road was taken out of the city and placed down in the sea in a tunnel. So you do it step by step. Another important step was earlier we had a requirement in the legal framework. When you're building a new building, of course you have to provide parking spaces. Well, not anymore. Instead of having a provision for building a minimum number of parking spaces, in that provision now it's a provision of providing a maximum number of parking spaces. We don't want parking spaces in downtown. How can we sell such a thing? You know, people that are building, they want parking. Well, if they get other benefits, it might be a good thing after all. Maybe you can build a building that's 2 stories higher. You're earning more money from the building. You want that instead of parking. So that kind of examples, it's a mentality, and both in the population and also in the authorities, in the government. So step by step, you're doing these things. Some things you can do very quickly, like providing more parking control as here in Moscow, just recent. Other things you will need some more time.
Добрый вечер, спасибо за презентацию. Я хотел бы задать вопрос более подходящий к системе транспорта в целом, чем нежели к автомагистральному, которую вы рассматривали сегодня. В частности, вы восхищались презентацией системы метро, которая построена в Москве. Она действительно великолепна и во многим городам есть чему поучиться, в том числе очень короткие интервалы между поездами и в целом система, которая способна перевозить больше десятка миллионов человек в день, это грандиозное сооружение. Однако во многом московский метрополитен является очень сильно загруженной системой. В частности, вот я проживаю в Кузьминках, и на моей линии существует то, что даже именуется своим термином. Это эффект Выхина. В 8 утра совершенно невозможно войти в какой-либо из поездов, который идет из Выхина, просто потому, что уже на конечной станции входит полный вагон людей, и плотность людей на площади вагона достигает 7 человек на квадратный метр. То есть просто грандиозное количество людей. И такое наблюдается достаточно много, где не только на транспортно-пресненской линии, на многих переходах в утренние часы очередь до эскалаторов для того, чтобы перейти на соседнюю линию, может достигать сотен метров. Ну, я, конечно, несколько утрирую, но 100 метров точно. Собственно, вопрос, а как, вот если пересаживать людей на общественный транспорт и при этом учитывать города-сателлиты, которые находятся в ближайшей области, как нам не перегрузить метро? Спасибо.
Well, there are two ways. One is to increase capacity of the lines, and the other one is to build more lines. On existing lines, if you are up to capacity, there is not much more you can do. Your intervals are minimum, so you cannot do much. But, and I've suggested that to the metro here, I would suggest any new lines should be built for 10-car trains rather than 7 or 8 cars. That would increase by 30% with very small increase in cost. So that, I think, was a mistake, that it was started in 1935 with 7 cars, and from then on you kept building cars where you saw that in some lines it's not enough. The second solution is that you need more lines, and the plans are quite extensive, quite a few lines. I don't know where your line is and whether that will be helpful, but there will be another circle line. There will be then development of regional rail system, and regional rail, what you have is in many ways not up to date, not most modern and efficient. The city, I understand, is working on doing that and making another circle with regional rail, so that most advanced cities have integrated regional rail and metro. And in German cities, in Berlin and Munich and so on, you have S-Bahn and you have U-Bahn, which are fully integrated in operations and so on. You have similar in most world cities. So you will have to build more. On the other hand, to some extent, if you are nadzemny общественный transport, which I think is something between metro and these buses in congested traffic, an independent system on the streets, if you design it well, you can unload metro for trips which are up to 3 or 5 kilometers, or even considerably, because your metro takes so much time to go down and up that if it's a very short trips, you would rather take the surface rather than go down. And if you speed up the surface, you can unload the metro at some critical points. So those are the possibilities.
Здравствуйте, уважаемые эксперты. Меня зовут Игорь, я работаю в департаменте транспорта. У меня к вам два вопроса. Первый вопрос. Существуют ли какие-то нормы, может быть, вы слышали, проектирование паркоматов к количеству парковочных мест, да? То есть сколько там необходимо паркоматов на число парковочных мест. А второй вопрос по применению автомобильных блокираторов. По-английски это wheel clamp или Denverboot. Слышали, наверняка слышали что-то об этом. Какая практика применения для легкового транспорта и большегрузного? Спасибо.
Let's see. The first one was
Regulation for parking.
regulations for parking went kind of in a circle. Already in 1950. Cities said, well, people are buying cars, we have problem with cars, where do we park them? So that they have the laws in some countries. If you build this and this many square meters of office or apartment, you must build at least one parking space. Then, in London, for example, 30 years ago, they said, just a minute, we're forcing people to build more parking, which means we'll have more congestion in the center city. We don't want that. We should limit, through parking regulation, we should limit number of cars that are coming to center city. And they reverse to say, if you have this much area.
His question was about how many parkomats shall be,
how many terminals for payments for parking should be per number of parking spaces.
Oh, that varies from city to city. It varies from the frequency of parking and the whole environment. Usually, we have in Philadelphia every about 100, 150 meters. They're fairly frequent, and you announce everywhere where you go to pay. Is that what you mean? Right? Okay. So, the parking regulations may influence then also the number of cars that you attract or not attract to center city. Now the clamps, I think they must be used, yes, because we have people who collect 100 unpaid tickets. I don't know how we tolerate that. Very inefficient judicial system. While if you put a clamp, you get that person that has to pay. So some enforcement is done. And if it's efficiently enforced, there is not too much use. People don't want to risk it.
I saw in Greece, police were removing license plates for car parking.
Okay, yeah.
Is it a good solution?
Depends on the city, it depends on situation.
Removing the plates is drastic, but we are doing it, from city to city, this is done differently.
In my city, it's not like the tax collector is getting the task of collecting the fine, which means that you are in trouble if you are parking wrongly. If you don't park, you get the tax collector after you, which is quite heavy.
У меня вопрос такой. Вам не показалось, когда вы анализировали эти два проекта, что приоритет строительства, капитального строительства дорог в Москве смещен с тех направлений, где они нужнее всего, на те направления, которые прилегают к проектам типа Сколково, Новой Москвы, Рублевки, то есть решают проблемы не более загруженных частей Москвы и пригорода, как Балашиха, Реутов, Королев, Пушкина, а проблема менее загруженных, но, так сказать, более богатых и престижных районов. Спасибо.
I don't think we are informed enough on that aspect. Really, we could not go into analyzing what is being done elsewhere and what are the social impacts. We did not include that.
Moscow, hope you like it better in summer than in winter, So I work for Google here in Moscow, so my question would be related. So as you may know, Google is working on self-driving cars in California, right? And they did already, I believe, 500,000 miles of self-driving without people guidance. So the question is basically, given the pace of changes Like 10 years ago, if I want to go somewhere, I need to buy a map, you know, and then drive in it, like have a, you know. And now I just talk to my phone, like I want to go there, and it's just, you know, quickly. So, given the pace of changes, in 10 years from now, and let's say, it might be well possible that, you know, all cars would be self-driving, and we have totally different problems, like with parkings and like building roads. So do you think government already should start thinking about this? Do you think it will happen at all? What's your opinion on this?
It's a big difference. You can use whatever technology you have, and you can make the car trip more efficient. But still, as a public transport passenger, you lose less than 1 square meter on your trip. As a car driver, you use more than 22 square meters per trip. So okay, you can use technology in a good way, but providing a lot of steel, 2 tons of steel and a lot of space for each car is a problem in large cities. But I agree, use technology both for cars and for public transport. And the same technology you are mentioning is also available for travel planners, for those who want public transport. So give them the same chance, and the whole network will function more efficiently.
Well, there has been talk about automated cars now for about 40 years. And for a long time there was not much change. And one of the problems in that was legal aspect. That if we have an accident now, we are responsible, we have insurance and so on. If there is a collision of automated vehicles, then it's the agency in charge of that responsible for the whole thing. So legal aspect was there. Now, there are also different types of cars. What used to be designed just for fully automated lanes, now we have cars which are intelligent cars which detect distances and can play. How will that work in mixed traffic is a separate question. But there is more movement in recent times, yes, and in California they do have some vehicles trying. I cannot give you a distinctive answer to that. There are some people who are still talking about PRT also, the automated vehicles which are going on guideways. That one I can tell you will never work because it's totally unrealistic. I don't want to spend time on it, but they go from city to city trying to sell this in totally unrealistic plans, and in many cities they confuse issues by those proposals. Now that's totally different than cars on highways.
Вы как специалисты должны понимать, сколько, либо у вас знакомиться с бюджетом всех вот этих вот улучшений, сколько стоит улучшение Ленинского проспекта и переход на северо-восточную хорду. А северо-западный, ну северо-западный, не принципиально. Я живу на севере, для меня не принципиально. Извините, для меня очень... Так вот, у меня вопрос. Вот все, что вы предлагаете, вопрос, оно будет дороже, оно будет дешевле, оно будет хотя бы в пределах, то есть 2 раза дороже. Что? Оно будет дешевле, оно будет дороже, оно будет столько же стоить. Вот переход, закупка трамваев, улучшение системы, вот именно в этих участках. Хотя бы на примере Ленинского проспекта. Или хорды.
It really depends on which specific recommendation we make. Some of them would make lower cost, some of them would make higher cost. We pointed out that, for example, cruising of buses indirectly would greatly increase the operating cost and lose passengers. The light rail transit, we think at this time Moscow should be looking how to introduce a new mode of that, and if there is sufficient number of riders, we think it would be feasible. And the number of riders seems to be fairly high, but we did not do detailed study. Now, we should be careful though. Usually, oh, rail is expensive. What about these 6 lanes? You know, so compared, we are making transit more expensive, looking more expensive, even if it carries a lot more traffic. So we should count also per passenger and so on. So we certainly did not suggest not considering any cost or feasibility. In general we did, but we did not do any exact cost estimates.
Довольно часто власти и планировщики заявляют, что если добавить в проект реконструкции Ленинского или хорды легкорельсовый транспорт, то это увеличит стоимость проекта просто в разы, во много раз, и это будет так дорого, что тогда просто невозможно ничего делать. Соответствует ли это действительности? Вот так ли действительно дорог легкорельсовый транспорт?
I heard one that it would add 40% of the cost. But I think that is not based on any detailed study either. So there is no positive detailed study of that proposal yet.
I think the important answer in general is that yes, you are adding costs by improving public transportation to a project. If you have a project just for car traffic, and you later on come with additions for public transport, of course it will be more expensive. But if you are counting capacity, then the total cost for your project will be lower. That means that, as Dr. Vучik said, the cost for each transported passenger will be lower in a project with public transport than without.
Добрый день. У меня такой вопрос. Ваши идеи очень классные, но у нас сейчас очень большое количество автомобилистов в городе. Если начать реализовывать ваши идеи, то на первом этапе они будут восприняты негативно со стороны этих автомобилистов. То есть они вспомнят, как они дешево и классно ездили на автомобилях в центр, а сейчас им предлагают ехать на общественном транспорте, плюс к этому они вспомнят, когда их машины встанут на прикол там возле двора, во дворе, то они неожиданно вспомнят, что эти машины дорого стоят, и мало того, что они теперь не могут на них ездить столько, сколько им бы хотелось, вот, плюс они должны еще ездить на общественном транспорте. Может быть, у вас есть какой-то опыт в работе с такими автомобилистами, то есть что сделать и куда девать, собственно, машины, которые окажутся не нужны?
If you see one of my books, it shows what's the cost of driving in the city by car and by transit. And by car, if you don't pay for parking, and that doesn't mean it's free parking, it means it's subsidized. Somebody's paying for you. You cost the others. If that is only the cost, it's very, very low. But the total cost of your driving, you add to it the cost of congestion that you are adding to all others. And the environmental costs and long-term costs and so on, the huge costs of the car, the driver does not compute, and many of them don't even understand it. So therefore, some cities have an environmental charge added to the gasoline and various other, that's the rationale, that's the reason for charges, because we have most subsidized vehicle, a car, not transit. Usually you say transit is losing money. No, if we would know how much we are subsidized in not paying for all those costs, for accidents, for all of that, a car is much more subsidized. But, so drivers should understand that is more complex than that. But I think that the drivers now, 2 days later, will already see the benefits of that charge, because they'll have easier driving to park, and the city will be able to use that parking space for 11 people per day, rather than one who came early enough and is parking the whole day for nothing, and really loading the city. In St. Petersburg, center city, you can park then for 2 weeks. It's physically impossible, it's inequitable, it's uneconomical, it destroys city. So that's the only thing that's wrong with it.
Just a little addition to that. Again, my city, for 20 years ago, the Automobile Association, which is very strong, they just told the politicians one single thing: build more roads. The same organization today say that build more public transport. The same with the road department, the highway department in Norway. Again, they were very strong on building roads, and they of course still are. But they're saying in the larger cities, we should be more careful. In Oslo, we should not build any more roads, not increase the capacity, at least not radial capacity. The truckers organization, which are operating trucks and big vehicles, saying the same thing. So there is a shift. You have to learn and you have to educate, and finally you see the benefits of people going away from the car and using public transport.
Добрый день, мистер Вучик, мистер Хотвайт. У меня вот такой вопрос по Ленинскому проспекту. Насколько я понял из предложений, у вас рассмотрено с сохранением разноуровневых развязок, да, то есть там, до добавления изменения числа полос и включения легкорейсового транспорта, но при этом сохранение разноуровневой схемы. Если я правильно понимаю, это довольно большая часть, опять-таки, затрат, да, на этот проект. Вопрос вообще, насколько обоснована в данном случае реализация разноуровневой схемы по Ленинскому. Спасибо.
We are really suggesting before that analysis that they reevaluate the assignment of traffic, the additional traffic which is coming. If we have bottleneck at Gagarin Square, and if we have bottleneck at Mekad, then we question whether this whole thing is justified, because then you are increasing capacity where it's not a bottleneck. You are solving the wrong problem. If they prove that they can handle that at the ends, then we are saying, well, then consider maybe 2 + 2, and in any case consider also LRT.
Все, наверное, на этом закончим. Спасибо. Всем, кто не успел задать вопрос, но вот время немножко ограничено. Доклад можно уже, я думаю, да, уже можно скачать у нас на сайте. Еще нельзя, значит, можно будет завтра скачать доклад у нас на сайте и почитать его подробно. Также я думаю, что мы будем печатать его в большом количестве экземпляров, не только вот эти 100 пилотов, которые мы сделали. И вообще дальше распространять информацию, которую здесь удалось получить. Большое всем спасибо.